The year was 1864. The American Civil War had dragged into its fourth bloody spring, and the Confederacy's greatest hope still rode a gray horse through the Virginia countryside. Robert E. Lee, the marble-faced commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, had spent 3 years turning back one Union general after another. McClellan, Pope, Burnside, Hooker, they all came with bigger armies, louder guns, and fresher recruits, and every single time, after a sharp fight, they turned tail and headed north. Lee had made it look almost easy. But now a new man sat in the saddle opposite him, Ulysses S. Grant. And Grant played by rules no one in Virginia had ever seen before. Grant had arrived in the East with a simple, brutal instruction from Lincoln: destroy Lee's army. Not capture Richmond first, not maneuver for glory. Destroy the army. Wherever Lee goes, Grant told Meade, there you will go also. No more polite withdrawals after a bloody nose. No more waiting for the next campaign season. This was going to be different, and Lee sensed it before the first shot was even fired. But sensing it and understanding it were two different things. Understanding came later, on a smoky ridge in the wilderness, when the smoke refused to clear and the blue columns refused to turn around. The Rapidan River ran swollen and brown. Grant's Army of the Potomac, more than 100,000 strong, began crossing on the 4th. Lee watched from the south bank, calm as ever, but his mind was already turning over the problem. The wilderness was waiting. That tangled second-growth forest of scrub pine and briars where artillery was useless and cavalry blind. Lee knew the ground like the lines on his own palm. He had beaten bigger forces there before. He gave the order quietly: let them come in, then hit them hard. The fighting started on the 5th. It was never a neat battle. It was two blind giants swinging at each other in the dark. Smoke hung so thick that men fired at muzzle flashes. Trees caught fire. Wounded soldiers screamed as flames crawled over them. Ewell's corps slammed into Warren's on the Orange Turnpike. Hill's men tangled with Hancock along the plank road. By nightfall, both sides had bled badly, but Lee still held the lines. He slept little. He rode among the men, his voice steady, reminding them that one more push and the enemy would break. The 6th was worse. Longstreet's 1st Corps finally arrived and slammed into the Union left like a sledgehammer. The flank attack rolled up the blue lines for nearly a mile. Lee watched it unfold, his face tight with hope. For a moment it looked like the old magic was working again. Then Longstreet was shot by his own men in the confusion, friendly fire in the smoke, and the momentum stalled. Still, when darkness fell, Lee believed he had done enough. The Union had lost nearly 18,000 men in 2 days. No general Lee had ever faced could stomach numbers like that and keep coming. He waited for the retreat. Dawn on the 7th brought only silence. No bugles sounding retreat, no columns marching north towards the fords. Instead, scouts began reporting movement, long, steady columns of blue infantry and wagons sliding south, not north. Grant was sidestepping. He was heading for Spotsylvania Courthouse, trying to slip around Lee's right and put himself between Lee and Richmond. Lee sat in his tent that evening, maps spread before him, a single candle burning low. One of his aides later remembered the moment. Lee's expression didn't change much. He rarely let it, but his eyes hardened. He had finally seen it. This wasn't McClellan. This wasn't Hooker. This man did not measure victory by ground gained or lost in a single afternoon. Grant measured it by how much of Lee's army was left at the end of the week. He would keep feeding men into the meat grinder, keep marching south, keep pressing until the Army of Northern Virginia was ground down to nothing. Retreat was no longer an option for either side. One of them had to be destroyed. Lee stood up. His voice was quiet but clear. He issued the order that would define the next 40 days of fighting. "We must move at once," he told his corps commanders. "Spotsylvania must be held. If Grant reaches it first, Richmond falls. We will get there ahead of him and we will crush his advance before it can take root. Those weren't flowery words for the history books. They were practical, urgent instructions. Lee was ordering a forced march, day and night if necessary, to beat Grant to the crossroads. He was ordering his exhausted, outnumbered men to dig in, to fight like cornered wolves, to turn every ridge and every stream into a killing ground. Because now he understood. Grant would never stop. So Lee had to make him pay so dearly that even Grant's bottomless supply of men and guns would eventually dry up. The race began immediately. Lee's men, many of them barefoot, many still bandaged from the wilderness, swung their rifles and started south through the same choking woods. They marched faster than anyone thought possible. Lee rode with them, his presence alone pulling the columns forward. By the morning of the 8th, they reached Spotsylvania just ahead of the Union vanguard. Lee's engineers had already picked the ground. The men started digging. Trenches, breastworks, abatis of sharpened stakes. They knew what was coming. What followed at Spotsylvania was some of the most savage fighting of the entire war. On the 9th and 10th, the Union slammed into Laurel Hill and the Confederate left, repulsed. On the 12th, Hancock's Second Corps smashed through a weak point in Lee's lines at the Mule Shoe salient. For 22 straight hours, men fought hand to hand in a pouring rain of bullets. The ground turned to red mud. Bodies stacked 3 and 4 deep. Rifles became so hot they couldn't be held. Lee himself rode forward, trying to lead a counterattack, until his own soldiers grabbed his horse's bridle and begged him to go back. "General Lee to the rear," they shouted. He went, but the order had already gone out. Hold that line at all costs. Counterattack. Drive them out. Crush the penetration before it widens. They did, barely. The Bloody Angle became a name that still chills anyone who reads the accounts. One Confederate private wrote home that the dead lay so thick a man could walk from one end of the field to the other without touching the ground. Grant kept throwing fresh divisions in. Lee kept feeding in his last reserves. And when the smoke finally lifted on the 21st, Grant had lost another 18,000 men and still hadn't broken through. Once again, he slipped south, looking for another opening. As December wore on and Savannah drew closer, the routine held steady, even as the stakes rose. The army hit swamps and rivers that tested the pioneers again. Sherman pushed them hard, but never beyond what they could handle. He was still out front, still smoking, still listening to the foragers' stories at night. When they finally reached the outskirts of Savannah on December 10th, the city didn't fall without a fight, but the march itself had already done its work. Sherman sent wagons and the sick and the prisoners back toward the coast, shifting the base to the sea. He rode out to meet the Navy, coordinated with Admiral Dahlgren, even got stuck in the mud on a low tide during one boat trip. The man never stopped moving. On December 21, Savannah was theirs. Sherman rode down Bull Street to the Custom House, took up headquarters in a fine house offered by a local Englishman, and sent his famous telegram to Lincoln, a Christmas gift of the city, complete with heavy guns, cotton, and stores. The march was over, but the daily grind had left its mark. 60,000 men had walked 300 miles, lived off Georgia, broken the railroads, and shown the South that its home front was no longer safe. Sherman had been right there with them every step, cigar in hand, eyes on the road ahead, turning war into something personal and relentless. Looking back on those 36 days, what stands out isn't just the strategy or the destruction, it's the sheer human texture of it all. The early mornings, the endless marching columns, the smoke of the fires twisting the rails, the laughter around the evening meals, the quiet moments by a cabin fire waiting for the wagons. Sherman's crazy daily life on the march to the sea wasn't glamorous. It was dusty boots, saddle-sore days, and the steady rhythm of an army that refused to be stopped. And in that rhythm, the Confederacy felt a blow it never quite recovered from. The war had changed, and William Tecumseh Sherman had been the one to change it 1 mile, 1 cigar, 1 hard-won supper at a time. By the end of May, the two armies had drifted east toward Cold Harbor. Lee's men were digging in again, turning a quiet crossroads into a fortress. Grant, sensing weakness after the long march, ordered a massive frontal assault on the 3rd of June. 7,000 Union soldiers fell in less than an hour. Lee watched from a ridge as the blue waves broke against his earthworks. For the first time in the campaign, he allowed himself a small, grim smile. His men had done what he ordered. They had held. They had made Grant bleed. But Grant didn't stop. He didn't retreat. He simply waited a few days, then slipped away again, south, across the James River, aiming straight for Petersburg. Lee, exhausted, his army down to barely 50,000 defectives, had to follow. He had understood Grant's style completely by then. There would be no grand Napoleonic battle that ended everything in one afternoon. There would only be siege, starvation, and slow death by attrition. The orders Lee gave in those final days of the Overland campaign were no longer about crushing Grant in the open field. They were about survival. Hold the lines, stretch the men thinner, make the Yankees pay for every yard. Historians sometimes call the Overland campaign Grant's victory by exhaustion, and in raw numbers it was. The Union lost more than 50,000 men. Lee lost perhaps 30,000, more than he could ever replace. But the story isn't that simple. Lee had understood something in those first days after the Wilderness that no one else in the Confederacy fully grasped until it was too late. Grant was not fighting for ground, he was fighting to destroy an army. And once Lee saw that, he gave the only order that made sense. Meet him head-on, make him bleed, force him to pay the highest possible price for every step south. He must be crushed, Lee essentially told his lieutenants in action, if not in those exact words. Crush the advance at Spotsylvania, crush the breakthrough at the Bloody Angle, crush the assault at Cold Harbor, crush the hope that this war could still be won on the cheap. It didn't work in the end. No one could crush Grant's style because Grant refused to play by the old rules. But Lee's orders in those 40 days bought the Confederacy another 9 months. They turned a lightning campaign into a grinding siege. They kept Richmond alive through another winter. And they proved that even when a commander finally sees the enemy's true nature, understanding it doesn't always mean you can stop it. The men who fought under Lee never forgot that spring. They remembered the smoke in the Wilderness, the rain at Spotsylvania, the silent horror of Cold Harbor. They remembered Lee riding among them, steady as ever, issuing orders that carried the weight of a man who had finally looked his opponent in the eye and realized the fight would go on until one side simply had nothing left. Grant's relentless style had changed everything. Lee's response, those urgent, desperate orders to hold, to counter, to crush, had changed nothing about the outcome, but everything about how the end would come. By the time the army settled into the trenches around Petersburg, the pattern was set. Grant would keep pressing, Lee would keep defending, and the war would grind on until the last Confederate supply wagon rolled to a stop and the last gray soldier laid down his rifle. But in that first week of May, on a ridge still littered with the dead of the Wilderness, Robert E. Lee had given the order that defined the rest of his command. Meet this new enemy with everything we have left, because if we do not crush him now, he will surely crush us later.